Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would answer some of your emails. And if I sound funny, it's because I have COVID and every single nook and cranny of my sinus system is chock full of my own phlegm. I'm quite stuffed up. But aside from that, I feel great. A lot better than I did when I had COVID last year, which was the worst. But I did break my sternum, so when I cough, which occasionally happens, it is a really fun time. All right, this first email is from long-term patron Raymond from the Netherlands. He writes, and by the way, I'm going to read the introduction to this email. Is him praising the podcast. I don't normally include that when I read emails on the podcast because it feels narcissistic and self-aggrandizing, but I occasionally like to read it because I want to honor the words and the life of the individuals that are writing in. And also, I don't know, this is why I do this thing. And I want to highlight that this podcast isn't just a thing for entertainment for many people. It's a community of understanding and maybe even healing in a lot of ways. So I want to include that, not as a way of praising myself, but as a way of highlighting that we're all in this together. So Raymond writes, "Thank you so much for everything you do. Your podcast means the world to me. I've been severely emotionally neglected and abused as a child by both of my parents. And after that, when I sought help from age 17 onwards, I was continuously re-traumatized by many different mental health care workers for 14 years. Your podcast has literally been a life-saving game changer in my recovery process. I cannot thank you enough for that. All words fall short. Not only do I feel validated on the endless amount of things, you've also helped me acquire so much wisdom, and hearing your voice helps me to feel a bit more grounded every single time. Perhaps most importantly, your podcast has helped me steer away from my past incompetent and seriously troubled therapists to my current therapists and social workers that finally seem to respect, understand, and prioritize what I need as a client." Just chiming in here, that's great, Raymond. I'm so glad that that's happened and that you fought for that and advocated for yourself. Going on with the email, I would like to ask you about a concept you mentioned several times on your podcast called thwarted belonging. I feel like this applies to me. Ever since I was a child, I often felt like I did not belong to my parents, nor to the town I grew up in, nor to the country I grew up in. I've often felt like I'm in a completely wrong place and that I should be living in a different life with very different people in a different country. I've often dreamt of living in the U.S., and I used to fantasize quite a bit about my dream life in an American high school. In my experience, this feeling is indeed related to suicidal thoughts and feelings like you mentioned on the podcast. I was wondering if you could talk about and elaborate about this concept of thwarted belongingness. What other concepts is it related to? I read online that suicidality is also related to perceived burdensomeness, a feeling that I can also relate to very much, unfortunately. I cannot remember you ever mentioning this term, perceived burdensomeness, though you have talked about the feeling about this, but you have talked about this feeling, of course. Do you agree with this correlation? So, trigger warning, I'm going to be talking throughout the rest of this episode about suicidality, fairly in depth. So if this is a trigger for you, I wouldn't listen, or I would talk with your therapist first. But yeah, burdensomeness, perceived burdensomeness is an important aspect of some models of suicidality, of what leads one to think about suicide and attempt suicide. But I excluded it from my model and from my emphasis as I talk about suicidality, because I consider it to be a part of thwarted belongingness. But perhaps it's important enough and different enough from belongingness that I should emphasize it. So just to remind folks, because I've done a deep dive on this and talked about this before, I'll remind y'all about my integrated model of suicidal intention and thoughts, it has 5 parts. One is distress, like depression, anxiety, rejection, grief, a physical problem, a loss, finances going badly. So some kind of distress needs to be present for the individual. Number 2, or a breakup, right? Did I mention that? I didn't mention that. Number 2 is perceived hopelessness about the distress. This is important because if, like, for example, right now I have a broken chest and COVID, but I have hope that I will recover. In all likelihood, my chest bones will stitch back together. My COVID symptoms will relent. And I think, given the data, long COVID isn't likely given the low severity of my symptoms. So I have hope. But what if I didn't? What if my chest pain and my COVID symptoms, I didn't have hope about it? What if I thought they would last forever? That would be rough, right? It's a very, very different situation. If you went through a breakup and you had hope that things would get better over time and maybe you would find someone else, maybe it's hard to imagine that right off the bat, but intellectually you think, yeah, I don't know, maybe in a few years I'll meet someone else. It's hard to imagine that right now, but I could see that happening. It's not impossible. That's different than I just got dumped and no one's ever going to love me and I'm never going to find anyone else. It's very, very different situation. So distress and perceived hopelessness about that distress. Number 3 is perceived thwarted belongingness. So when we go through distress, and even if we're hopeless about it, if we have togetherness and closeness and support and love and loyalty and commitment and attachment, then in all likelihood, we will not think about suicide, because our prime directive as humans is togetherness and attachment. So when we feel together, even if everyone is going through the same distress, then that can keep us going without resorting to the sorts of thoughts that lead to suicide. So if I were to include perceived burdensomeness in my model, I would consider it, at least in my head right now, I would consider it to be a subset, but worth mentioning as a part of thwarted belongingness. I actually changed my notes to reflect this in terms of what you're saying, Raymond, that perceived, because in other models, they will have burdens, feeling like a burden as a major factor that leads to suicidality. And it is a very, very common feeling, but I would have clients who would have suicidality that wouldn't feel like a burden, and they would feel thwarted belongingness. They might not word it like thwarted belongingness, but what I would be hearing from them would be that. Because a lot of people, when they are thwarted in terms of their belongingness and their togetherness, they will resort to a defense of, well, I don't need anybody and I don't care. So consciously, they don't think they're being thwarted. They think of themselves as rejecting everyone else, but deep down, they do feel thwarted. And it's important to emphasize both of these concepts, that just being alone isn't thwarted belongingness, because if someone just doesn't like to hang out with other people very much, then they're not being thwarted, right? Even if they are being thwarted, they don't really care. So it's all relative to how much contact you want. On the other side of the spectrum, let's say you have someone that craves and needs a lot of togetherness and a lot of attachment, then they might look like they have a lot of attachments and togetherness, but it is less than what they need. And the other aspect of this is that they're being thwarted. They're being actively rejected. They feel actively, maybe a better phrase would be perceived thwarted belongingness, because some people are actually not being actively thwarted and rejected, but they feel that way, they interpret it that way. They might be doing things that sabotage themselves in relationships, and then they they distort the situation such that they believe that other people are pushing them away when in fact they're the one that are pushing other people away. But at the very least, they perceive that they are asking for belongingness and they are being rejected by everybody, not just by some, but by everyone. They feel thwarted across the board for the most part. And then perceived burdensomeness is that in all likelihood, they're not a burden to other people, but they perceive themselves as a burden. It's very, very common for people who are thinking about suicide to say something along the lines of, I want to do everyone around me a favor by killing myself because then other people won't have to worry about me anymore. All I am is just wasting space, and all I am is a burden to other people. So I'd be doing other people a favor. And it really points to how even in distress, we as humans are still trying to care for other people. We are trying to take care of others. We're trying to be nice to others. And we think of ourselves as a burden. And there's lots of other examples of this, like in times of war in the military, people will, certainly this happens in the movies, but it happens in real life where people will say, leave me behind. Don't wait for me. Save yourself. Humans are generally good and they will do that. And so makes me want to cry, it makes me cry thinking about it. But when people are such in the dumps, there's this catch-22 that happens, this vicious cycle where what they need is contact, but they believe they're so worthless and so unappealing that they don't reach out to other people, and thus, there's the vicious cycle of more and more isolation, more and more loneliness, and they can be a bit of a burden. But the thing is that I've never met someone who thought they were a burden, because I've had people in my personal life that are like this. I've never actually encountered a situation where someone thought they were a burden and other people thought they were too much of a burden. Like I'll just speak in generalities, but let's say I have a friend, and I've experienced this in real life, but I'm just making up a hypothetical of a friend that I have come to know that they have suicidality and depression and perceived burdensomeness. And I will even sometimes have this conversation. I'll say, well, yeah, you are kind of a burden, but it's not a problem. It's not hard to carry this burden. Please lean on me. Please rely on me. Yes, right now our relationship is a little one-sided, because what I have come to realize, both as a therapist and as a friend, is that if I deny that they're a burden, then the person who believes they're a burden will detect that I'm lying either to them or to myself, because the relationship by its nature is likely lopsided in that moment, because that individual is, it's like if someone were to be suffering from cancer and going through a lot of treatment and they need a lot of support. Well, in that moment, I'm probably going to be giving more to that person than they're going to be giving to me. And that's okay, right? So one, you could say it's a burden. It's also just the back and forth of a relationship, or it's just the joy of supporting other people, right? So I will have that conversation. I won't deny that it is a little lopsided right now, but I'm totally okay with it. And by being honest in this way, I believe that I can tell the person, either a client or a friend, that trust me, if you are too much of a burden, I will tell you, because I am an honest person, as shown by the fact I just admitted that you are a burden to me sometimes, but that's okay. I would have it no other way. And by God, if I were in your shoes, I would require you to carry a little bit of my burden. That's what life is. Life is not a set of isolated events. Life is meant to be shared, good and bad. And so, I don't know, it makes me cry thinking about this too as well. although I don't know if that's just my COVID juices coming out of my eyes. Well, when I started this podcast, I was like, do I just lean into the grossness of this whole thing? And I don't know. This is how I am. I hope I'm not a burden to you. Anyway, so yeah, perceived burdensomeness I consider to be a subset of the thwarted belongingness, because although I don't know, maybe it justifies its own category. I went back and forth a few years ago when I was working on this deep dive, because there's a lot of different models. And let me see if I can pull that up. Well, let me take a break and I'll look for those models in my notes. Okay, we're back from the break. Well, so I'll finish my model. And so we have distress, perceived hopelessness about the distress, perceived thwarted belongingness / perceived burdensomeness. Number 4 is acquired means to kill oneself, because you can have all the intent in the world, but if you don't have the preferred means to do so, then an attempt is impossible, right? Although it's not really hard to find means, but there are situations where people will have a spike in intention, and what gets them through the high risk moment is that there's no convenient way to complete suicide, and then a few days pass and their intent to kill themselves subsides, and they're better, so there's that. Also, a big part of safety planning for suicidality is to eliminate and reduce the possibility of the individual getting their hands on the means of suicide. So that's another important aspect of it. And then number 5 is acquired capability. This is another important aspect that often isn't emphasized, that for someone that is intent on killing themselves and they have a plan and they have the means, like a gun, for example, in their house, there's a final step that needs to occur, which is the individual has to have the word for it is capability, but another way of describing it is the ability to pull the trigger, because our instinct to remain living is strong, and it takes a lot to overcome that. And some people can overcome that very quickly, and that's why a lot of people are drinking or using other substances, because it takes away those inhibitions, which is another huge risk factor, by the way. So the model, the other models incorporate this, but many don't. Okay, and I emphasize all of those final, because the first 3 are psychological, right? Distress, perceived hopelessness about the distress, and perceived thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness. These are social, psychological. And then the practical parts are the means and the I guess capability is also another psychological part. But anyway, so going into the other models, there's the interpersonal side, and by no means are these all. I just have a couple here that I know to be the 2 of the popular models of suicidal thoughts and attempts. So the first one is interpersonal psychological theory, developed by Thomas Joyner, 2005. This is a popular one. And it includes, number 1, thwarted belongingness, number 2, hopelessness, number 3, perceived as a burden. So for Thomas Joyner, he breaks that out, which maybe I should too. Number 4 is acquired capability, and that's it. So maybe the capability includes the means for them, I'm guessing. So pretty close to my model, right? But just worded a little differently. Another model by Klonsky and May, 2015, the 3-step theory. Number 1 is psychological pain and hopelessness. So it has my first 2, elements combined into one. Number 2, a lack of connectedness. So this is another way of saying thwarted belongingness. But that's different because you can lack a connection but be okay with that relatively, and that isn't thwarted belongingness, right? I mean, the way to think about it is that when we feel actively rejected, then there's no hope, right? Whereas if you just feel isolated and a lack of connection, but you believe that if you worked on it, people would be open potentially to connecting with you, then that's a very different feeling, right? That there's less hopeless. Plus, like, I think we possibly evolved an extreme reactivity to being actively rejected by our people, by our tribe, by our kin, as a way to heavily motivate us to gain closeness and attachment. And that anger, that distress, that high level of upsettedness that we, I think, evolved to feel, and the high level of pain, literal pain that we feel, can, for some, if chronic, can motivate us to do something to end that pain, which some will start thinking about suicide. So it's not just lack of connection, as Klonsky and May say. And then the third element is suicidal means. So they don't include the capability, but I don't know if that's that big of a deal. So, my model isn't that different from the other models, which kind of says something, right? That there's a fair amount of consensus about the elements of suicidal intention and attempting, but they're all just worded a little bit differently. And that's interesting, So just going on here, getting back to your email, long-term patron Raymond from Netherlands, you ask, and most importantly, what do I need to know about how to recover from this feeling of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness? Well, the way that I see it is that you need the opposite, which we might call unconditional belongingness, or committed relationships, committed attachments, loyal relationships, loyal attachments. I feel like in today's the word loyalty is associated with patriotism, or with being loyal to a cult leader or a politician in a bad way or something. But loyalty is extremely important. I know that I am loyal to my wife and to my family and to my friends, and I know that they are loyal to me. When I'm not around my wife, and even if she's upset at me for one reason or another, and she's talking with her friends, or I don't know, maybe even an angry listener to the podcast or someone on YouTube were to email in to my wife and say what a jerk face I am, I know that my wife is loyal to me and will stick up for me, or at the very least won't pile on. How do I know that? Well, it's trust and our track record together. But also, I was raised by loyal parents and loyal siblings, and I was loyal to them. This is where the model of relationships and therapy, contextual family therapy put forth by Naj, which I've talked about. I've done a deep dive on that. That's why he emphasizes loyalty and trustworthiness. And it's just another way of looking at attachment and attunement and attachment security, just another angle to it. But it emphasizes something, commitment. My family just had, I talked about this in the other episode, that my family had a 60th redo to my parents' anniversary, right? 60th anniversary redo. And I was basically in charge of organizing the whole thing, so I'm inviting everyone. And, I organize a lot of things like this, whether it's for work or for fun. And when you invite people and they say yes, you never know if at the last minute they're going to pull out or something gets in the way. But with my family, when they said yes, 6-9 months ago, even people that are new to the family, like partners, plus ones, right? Like Alina, for my nibbling, my brother's kid, has a partner, Parker, who, by the way, Parker, his mom listened to the podcast before Parker and Alina were going out, so it was kind of interesting in that way. But he and Alina, they're not married, but when he said he was coming, I knew he was going to be there. So with my family, that's loyalty, that's commitment, right? That's dependability, that's a mutual understanding. And, that's just one element. And if someone had something else come up, I wouldn't consider them to be disloyal or not committed. But when you add up all of the different behaviors and indications of loyalty and commitment, it adds up to a very healing and regulating and pleasing feeling for me. I don't have to see these people in my family or my friends. I don't have to see them very often to know that they're committed to me, they're loyal to me, and I to them. So that is the opposite of thwarted belongingness. The other word I put in there is unconditional belongingness. I know that my family and my friends and my wife love me unconditionally. That if I were, there are question marks in my head as to whether or not they would truly love me if, I killed someone or I don't know. But within reason, right? Within the normal shames of life, like if I start to gain weight, or if I made a mistake at work, or if I said something stupid at dinner, or if I didn't show up to a family event or something, I am positive that they would still love me afterwards. Not everyone knows that, right? Because they weren't shown that and they don't have those kinds of relationships. So you ask, Raymond, what do you need to, what do you need to know about to recover? Well, you need to know about how to cultivate those relationships. And that's the word that I use with my clients is cultivate. You can't just snap your fingers and have those relationships. The relationships that I have, friends and family, I have been working on daily since I was born, whether I was conscious or not. And it just takes time, and it sucks, right? Because if you didn't have it growing up and you distrusted others enough that you either sabotaged or distanced yourself from others, or you were attracted to people similar to your family such that you weren't attracted to people that would be loyal to you or good to you, then you could be 35 years old and have never experienced anything close to unconditional belongingness. So you're starting from scratch. Well, I started from scratch when I was born, and everything was given to me, right? I didn't have to do anything actively to attain attachment security and unconditional belongingness. And I remember thinking that, I don't know when it would have come up, maybe in church or something, about this idea of unconditional love. And I remember when I was very young evaluating that my family unconditionally loved me. I consciously knew that it was unconditional, that no matter what I did, they would love me, hands down. Like there's just no question about it, And I now have the benefit of, throughout my life, having to only put a little bit of effort in every day to that. Whereas if you're 35 and you want to, in 5 years, have at least, 3 relationships that are unconditional belonging, it's hard, right? You've got to be really careful. You've got to choose the right people. How do you know you're choosing the right people? Where do you look? It's hard. People are busy is another thing. So it's hard, but so worth it. And with therapy, you can at least have one person, and this is what I do with my clients, is I will even have this explicit conversation. I will say, under these kinds of circumstances, I'll say, and while we're working on this for you to cultivate these kind of relationships, know that you've already cultivated one with me. I know who you are, and I unconditionally like you. I unconditionally am attached to you. So you can take that or leave it. Of course, it's up to you, but know that I will never reject you. I will never let you down. I will never try to harm you. I will never not like you. You could tell me something awful that you have done, and I would still like you or love you or prefer you or be loyal to you. That's just the bottom line. And I've always been able to say that because I knew I would never leave Seattle. I mean, now with Zoom therapy and stuff, it doesn't really matter. But back in the day, you couldn't really say that if you suspected you might move out of the area and thus have to terminate with all your clients. I wonder if that's changing, that kind of thing, where it gives clients and therapists the opportunity to have more likelihood of a forever relationship, and therefore more conducive to that kind of corrective experience. I don't know. But anyway, but it's so worth it. And I've worked with clients successfully, and it's hard. Boy, is it hard. But so your next question is, what model of treatment do you use? Well, the model of treatment I use is attachment-based. It's psychodynamic-based. It's humanistic-based. But it's also cognitive therapy-based and schema-based. I incorporate all things. It's feminist-based. It's culturally based. So it really just depends on the person, because thwarted belongingness is, in every person, it's different. So in general, I follow two principles of therapy, which is awareness and corrective experiences. So regarding awareness, I work with people about their cognitions, their self-talk, their self-sabotage, their emotional awareness and regulation, their differentiation. Also, we would talk about pragmatic tips of cultivating committed relationships, because sometimes people need those kinds of tips, how to navigate a relationship. I get questions like, people email in sometimes. I have a friend that I want to cultivate a stronger relationship with. What do I do? Am I burdening them by texting them too often, that kind of thing? And, it gets complicated because there's no easy answer to that. And generally speaking, in our culture, in mainstream American culture, there are a lot of messages to not be a creeper and to not be pushy. And yeah, for sure, don't be pushy. Don't push people into a corner. But that's not the same as being honest. You can tell someone, look, I know this might sound weird, but I like you as a friend, and there's no pressure here, but I'm going on a campaign in my life to have stronger relationships, and I've been thinking about the people in my life, and you're one of the people that I'd love to be good friends with. We're already friends, but I'd love to be maybe even closer. It's totally up to you, no pressure. But you're on my short list, that kind of thing. I've had conversations like that before. People have had conversations like that with me. I won't mention who, but some of the close people in my life, I did not think of them as close people. I thought of them as friends, but I didn't think of them as close friends until they came to me with some kind of communication like that. And then I said, oh yeah. There's a little second there where I'm like, wait, do I want this? Right? Because I hadn't really considered that. I can't consider them to be that close. But more often than not, if not every time, the times I can think of off the top of my head, I always would say, yeah, absolutely. Because there's a thought in my head of just like, well, if I didn't choose them to be like a best friend, then why would I say yes to this now? But another aspect of this is I want people in my life that are dedicated to closeness and are loyal. If someone's loyal to me, I will be loyal to them. And that means a lot, right? Because, sometimes you have friends who you have a great time with, but at the end of the day, if one of you were to move across town or to another state, or you had a bad incident between the two of you, then there's a chance that you might not ever talk to him again. Like with Umberto, when we first met, we became very close very quickly. We shared a lot in common, and I noticed that we were getting close. And then there were some early incidents in our relationship when we got into some arguments. And under other circumstances, I would have said, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't be that close to this guy. Or maybe I should be kind of close, but keep him at arm's length a little bit or something. But at some point, I remember consciously saying, no, I want to be very close to this guy. And if I'm going to get close, then I'm going to start bumping up against his sharp points, his flaws, or our mutual flaws are going to rub up against each other. And I have to push through that, or accept that, or work with it, or find a way to smooth out those edges, because I'm making a conscious choice that he is the one for me, kind of a thing. And anyway, so sometimes it's that, but pragmatic tips. So that's awareness. The second one is corrective experiences. So the individual can start, the client can, with me, have unconditional belongingness. And then they can start to generalize that feeling and that trust to the outside world, and to start cultivating relationships outside of the therapy office, with the goal, to some extent, to be able to let go of me and rely on the people in their personal life. This is harder than it sounds, right? It sounds easy, right? You have someone that wants unconditional belongingness, especially if I'm the one, seems like it'd be easy because I am trained, I am experienced, I know how to not take things personally. But for individuals that have thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, because of the hurt and the relational traumas they've been through, they often have a lot of defenses that push people away or keep people at a distance. It's a very common feeling that I will have as a therapist, countertransferentially, as I'm working with someone like this, where I will feel rejected. And if I don't watch it, I will manage that by not trying to get close, or by subtly rejecting the client myself. And it's subtle. The client might be saying they want to get close. They might be showing up to therapy sessions on time every week. But as they talk, they might not let me in, right? Or when I try to be warm to them, they downplay it or something, or they don't really believe it, right? They might outwardly show that they appreciate it, but deep down they're like, well, he's just at work. I'm just paying him to do this. And so it's hard. It's hard work. But with time, usually people will gravitate towards the healing. Going on with your email. But first, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So, Raymond, getting back to your email. And lastly, what do other leading people in the field have to say about this concept? Just chiming in here. The answer is, I don't really know. I don't really live in that circle. And I don't hear people discussing perceived burdensomeness very often, but suicide experts definitely will talk about it. So there's that. And going on with your email, it says, thank you very much. End of email. Yeah. Well, Raymond, I hope you're doing well. Let me know how you're taking what I'm saying here. And if you have any other questions, please send those in. Okay, so I just spent some time going through the Google Docs that Stacy populates with all of your emails. And I realized that a few months ago, I wanted to comb through all of the Google Docs and either answer the emails or delete the emails from the Google Doc. And I realized I never finished that project. I do remember getting to all the middle and upper tier patron emails and those people who are both patrons and YouTube members, because those are the emails that I start with. But I only got to some of the lower tier patron emails, and I didn't even get to the document of the emails from people who aren't patrons or YouTube members. And I was looking for any email that had to do with suicide since I'm on this topic. But I thought it would be good to end this episode with something lighter. But there is one email that relates, and it is a bit lighter and shorter. But I wanted to say that I cleaned up the Google Doc significantly, and I started to organize. I have this whole way of organizing all the emails into different docs. Like there are emails that are good for Bob, there are emails that are good for me only, there are emails that are good for Rebecca, there are emails that are good for Berto, and I grouped them and cleaned them up, and it takes a long time. It takes longer than you would think, actually, to do all that. I wish that I could pay someone to do that, but it's so particular to me that I just have to do it. Plus, it's not that hard, and there's a bit of the good old obsessiveness that an organization that I get a pleasure from of stacking things and organizing them. So I'm saying this because I realized that there were emails that go back 2 years. There were emails from 2 years ago or a year ago, and I figured unless there was a real compelling, many of those older questions that I never got to, I did eventually answer because, it wasn't the exact question that I answered on the air, but it was a similar enough question. So I figured maybe those people who emailed in had some satisfaction from having a question that was related to theirs or something. But also I just figured after 2 years, are they still patrons? Did they forget they even asked the question? Because some people ask questions, they'll be like, yeah, next week I'm doing this thing. What should I do? I figure, that ship has passed. So I just went through and deleted a lot of the emails. And if you emailed in a long time ago and you really want that question to be answered, I know how it feels to email a podcaster that you have a parasocial relationship with and to have them not respond to you. I hate that feeling. So I apologize. I do read the emails and I do care, of course, but the volume of emails are such that it's just impossible for me to address every single one. And I don't want you to feel the way I feel when no one gets back to me. I also encourage you to feel free to email in. Again, if you email in and you don't hear a response within 3 or 4 months, that doesn't mean your email isn't in the line up to eventually be answered. But if it's been 12 months, then in all likelihood, the email has been lost, or I have deleted it because I just took too long to get to it or something. So I hope that's okay with y'all. And, there are some emails where people are being very kind to me. There's, oh my God, I love your podcast. I had a question. And, it feels really shitty to just delete those. I wish there was some AI where I could just look at that and just talk to my computer and say, email that person and tell them that I appreciate what they're saying. Because I know it's not that hard to copy and paste an email address and then type it out. But I tell you, the volume of emails, it would just take me, it sounds weird. There's this other YouTuber that I watch. He repairs guitars, and a lot of acoustic guitars, and I love guitar YouTube channels, and I like him a lot. He's entertaining and interesting. He's a very particular kind of person. And the YouTube channel is called T Woodford. It looks like To Woodford anyway, but he was talking about how he gets a lot of emails as his YouTube channel has gotten a little bit more popular, and he was feeling bad about not being able to respond because he used to be able to respond to everyone, similar to the way I used to be able to respond to everyone. And he did a mathematical calculation that if he spent the minimal amount of time replying to every email, that would be 2 minutes. And in all likelihood, it wouldn't be 2 minutes. It would be like 5 or 10 minutes, but because it takes a while to think, to read and to think and and then when you get to another email, you kind of have to reset your head. It all takes time. And he was saying, even if I keep it to just 2 minutes, if I respond to every single email, even if it's just like, hey, thanks for the email, then that is the equivalent in hours to a month and a half of work. And he's saying, I would rather spend that time, fixing guitars and making content. But I apologize. And I thought about that, and I get way more emails than he does. Not that I'm saying I'm better. I'm just saying that he was talking about how many emails he got, and I was just like, oh, it must be nice, because he was thinking he could reply. I'm guessing if I replied and I spent those 2 minutes, it might be half of the year. I don't know. So I know how shitty it feels to, especially some of y'all who like pour your heart and soul into these messages, that you fill out on the website, and to just get like ghosted. It feels really bad, I get that. And I don't know what to do about it. Like maybe there will be some solution to it. I don't know. I'll give it some thought, but I have before. I just hope that you will know that I care and I don't feel good about not responding. All right, so let's go on to another email. And that is from anonymous patron, and she says, when I was a teenager, I suffered from suicidal ideation, and I struggled quite a bit with school and life. When I was a teenager, I suffered from suicidal thoughts. In order to motivate myself to keep going, I imagined my classmates, who all hated me, reacting with glee when I killed myself. Because I also hated them, this motivated me to keep damning them with my presence. What schema is this? By the way, thank you for what you do. Yes, you were right. Age 14 was the worst year of my life, but I survived and I am thriving now. End of email. So I don't know if I've said this recently, but I found as a therapist that had about a third of my specialty of my client base in the first 10 or 15 years of my career was with teenagers and their parents, the teenagers were defiant, breaking rules, that kind of stuff. And the age that I found of most of my teenage clients were 14. There were 13-year-olds for sure, and there were 15-year-olds for sure. But it was rare to see a 12-year-old, and it was rare to see like a 16, 17-year-old, unless I was continuing working with a 14-year-old that had aged, right? But there were so many 14-year-olds. It's the transition between my conceptualization was that at 14, you have all of the good and bad of being a child and all of the good and bad of being an adult. In that, at 14, you're still very immature. You are really inexperienced, but you're also wanting to be carefree, and you have an innocence to you. But you also have all the adult aspects where you have the hormones of an adult, you have the desires of an adult, you have a tremendous desire to be independent potentially, and managing your own life for yourself, and you have arguably adult basic intelligence. You have the ability to somewhat think through actions, and make plans for good or for bad. I'm not saying this quite well, but you get the picture. And so, if you're 12 and things aren't going well, in my experience, you'll allow your parents to dictate your life for better or for worse. But at 14 and 13 for sure is when another way that I saw it was that 13 was when the shit hit the fan, but it would take a year for the family to finally resort to coming to therapy. So there's that. And I would have the pleasure of working with a lot of these families for a long time. And I would see these kids at 16, 17 change and manage their life much better. They would still be allowed to break rules. They would still break rules sometimes, but they would do it in a way that was less in your face, Because like when I was a teenager, I didn't follow my parents' rules all the time, but I didn't like shove it in my parents' face. And if I got caught, then I was sorry. At least I acted like I was sorry. Whereas these, in terms of the kids that I worked with, they were just like, fuck you. And, sometimes for viable reasons, which, I would work on. But anyway, so that's what Anonymous Patron is saying, is that when she was 14, that was the worst year of her life. Yeah, so that's the other side of the coin, which is it's not only the worst year for the parents and the teachers, but it's also the worst year for the kid. That's, it's all part and parcel. But you say, when you were a teenager, you thought about suicide, but to keep yourself going, you hated, because you hated your classmates, you were like, I am going to stay on this earth just so they have to deal with me. If I kill myself, it'll make them happy, and I don't want to make them happy, so I'm going to stay alive. Okay, so you ask, what schema is this? Well, you could think of it my first reaction is not to think of it as a schema, but if we go there, then it could be an overcompensation, I suppose, of the thing is in order to answer the question of what schema it is, I need to know why you were thinking about suicide in the first place. If we imagine that you felt thwarted belongingness, maybe, then there are different ways of dealing with schemas, right? Which we have surrender or avoid or overcompensate. And you could argue, I guess, that you are overcompensating by forcing your belongingness or forcing your presence on other people, right? Even though you felt thwarted, you're like, the ultimate thwarting would be to kill myself and take myself out of these people's lives, which would please them. But I'm going to overcompensate for that and push back on that. And I'll force myself into their life in terms of them having to deal with my presence. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's one way of putting it, given the short email. But the way that I see it more generally is that of one thing that I do with a lot of clients, whether they have suicidal thoughts or not, but particularly when they have suicidal thoughts, is I explore anger. And I try to get the client to get in touch with their needs and their anger. A lot of people, and particularly people who are suicidal, are not in touch with their needs and their anger. We all deserve to be in touch with our anger. Our anger is an indication of injustice and harm to ourselves. It's the motivator to protect ourselves, to get what we deserve, and to push back on injustice for us and against other people. And without that, then we just get walked on, and we might even walk on ourselves in a way. So for you felt that anger, which is good. And you felt angry at your classmates for rejecting you, or whatever else they were doing to you. And when we identify and feel our anger, we feel power and we're in connection with our needs. When you are angry, you are in connection with your needs. It's very important to understand. Now, what do we do with that anger? That's very important, right? We don't just punch people in the face or reject everyone around us, right? We are given an opportunity to think about that, and we should think about that. But when we are feeling angry, we are standing firmly on the foundation of who we are and what we need. It's a wonderful feeling. I love feeling my anger. I love it. It's empowering. It's invigorating. It's motivating. What do I do with the anger? That's important, right? So when you are feeling that anger, that gives, let's look at the alternative, that your classmates are hating you, they're rejecting you, you feel suicidal, and you ignore or deny, or you don't fan the flames of your anger. Well, it's just yet another example, another manifestation of you not getting what you need, and you not in touch with your feelings, you not in touch with your needs, with the injustice in your life. And so it could have been anything. It could have just been angry. This is directly related. You're like, I'm not going to kill myself because I'm so angry at my classmates. I want to annoy them with my presence. But to me, it just happens to be anger related to your suicidality regarding your thwarted. It's like folding in on itself, if that makes sense. Anyway, but more often than not, the anger is something else. Like you're angry at, what's an example? Like you're angry at everyone who thinks you're going to be a loser or you're never going to amount to anything. And you get angry and you say, I'll show them. I'm going to stay alive so I can show them that they're wrong. And I'm going to work hard and I'm going to make sure that I'm a success in some way. And then in 10 years, I'm going to come back to this town and I'm going to shove it at everyone's face. Now, in all likelihood, you'll recover, hopefully, by that time, and you won't need to shove it in their face. But it's you being in touch with your needs, right? On the surface, you're like, fuck you, I'm going to show you. But underneath it all is, hey, I deserve to have self-esteem. I deserve to be recognized for my abilities. I have worth. I'll show them I have worth. I feel I have worth to myself. That's the need you're in connection with, and it's manifesting in anger, and that anger is manifesting in this mission to show other people. And if you meet those needs one way or another, then you won't need to shove it in their face, because that's not really what you're interested in. What you're interested in is feeling good about yourself and achieving some kind of self-esteem. So for you, anonymous patron, to stay alive, I don't know exactly where you're coming from, but you're just like, well, I have one thing that I can do, and that is to strike back at these people with my presence, and that feels so good because they deserve to have someone annoy them, and but deep down, it's I have worth, and their hatred of me is unfair. If you went along with the hatred of you, then you'd say, well, I deserve it and I deserve to die. But you said, no, I'll show them. I do have worth. At the very least, I have worth to push back on these assholes. That's a piece of my of why I'm on this planet, is to push back on assholes, and I'm going to do it in this way. I don't know exactly where you're coming from, but that's how I see it. All right, so let's find. I'm going through my emails here on my documents, trying to find a short one. Oh, here's a short one. The giving tree. So this person, I think, asked a long time ago. It is YouTube member Sloan. She says, Kirk, I would really like to hear your thoughts on Shel Silverstein's book, The Giving Tree. Many believe it's an allegory for parenting. Some say the giving tree is the perfect parent, while others say the tree needs better boundaries. Some people even feel the book traumatized them. What do you think of the relationship in this? What do you think of the relationship depicted in this classic children's story? End of email. Yeah, this isn't exactly light, but but I love Shel Silverstein. I love The Giving Tree. It is the perfect emo book for me. But I understand where people are coming from. And I actually recently watched a little YouTube documentary about the reactions to this book. I didn't realize there was a lot of very different reactions to this book. So if you're not familiar with this book, I highly recommend you pause the podcast and buy it and read it. The reason why I love Silverstein so much is because he was huge in the 70s and maybe the 60s, I think, as well. And my young kindergarten teacher, she seemed so old to me at the time, but she was probably, in her 20s or something. And I think every day she would read a Shel Silverstein poem to us. And we would look at the art. And there's something so, I don't know how to describe it. Because Shel Silverstein, the poems on the surface, I guess, are for kids, but there are some complicated, dark feelings and notions in his poetry. And I think it really, because, there were other books that the teacher would read and other poems and other, funny little passages, but Shel Silverstein really stuck with me, and the art. And so The Giving Tree is, at least from my knowledge of Shel Silverstein's work, rare in that the whole book is one story, whereas typically Shel Silverstein's book, The Light in the Attic or Where the Sidewalk Ends, are several different poems, if you know what I'm saying. Each page is a different poem. Anyway, so The Giving Tree is a story about, and I'm going to butcher it because I'm doing it from memory. I'm literally looking at the book right now. I can see it's on my shelf across the room, and it's on top of my Watership Down book. But the Watership Down book is a graphic novel that I have yet to read of Watership Down. I love Watership Down. I love the movie from the 70s or late or early 80s. And I also love the Netflix limited series. It's like 4 episodes. I recently rewatched the Netflix series and just loved it. I understand if people wouldn't like this sort of thing, but there's just something about it that I just love. Again, similar to Shel Silverstein in that Watership Down is ostensibly for kids, but it's not really for kids. It's pretty advanced and it's dark. There's some real darkness and like I wouldn't give a kid in grade school the book Watership Down or have them watch the movies. I would think twice about that, honestly. But anyway, so, and side note, if you know Watership Down, the character Bigwig, or I think his actual name, because Bigwig is his nickname in the Watership Down world, but I think his name is Thlaley, and I love all the words that he made up. Anyway, when I read this book, I was maybe like 10 years old, and at the time, I was a lot bigger and taller than all my classmates, and I felt like a monster. I would try to scrunch down as I walked because I wanted to fit in. But in Watership Down, Bigwig is the fighter. He is valued for his physical abilities. And I very much identified with Bigwig, and I still kind of do, even though a lot of people caught up to me eventually. I mean, I'm still above average-ish, but not nearly as much as I was when I was 10. And I just remember thinking, oh, I wish I lived in a Watership Down world where I was valued for being gargantuan. Anyway, but The Giving Tree. Okay, so I'm going off memory. that there's a child who comes to a tree, and the tree is personified, and the tree gives the boy an apple, I think. And then the boy comes back as a teenager, and the boy, I think, has a girlfriend, and the boy wants to carve, his name plus the girl's name, like Johnny plus Debbie with a heart, how people would do that into a tree. I could have this wrong. Maybe I should just get the goddamn book. Okay. I got the book here. And okay. So once there was a tree, and she loved a little boy, and every day the boy would come, and he would gather her leaves and make them into crowns and play king in the forest. He would climb up her trunk. Just the art and everything is just so beautiful. And swing from her branches and eat apples. And they would play hide and go seek. And when he was tired, he would sleep in her shade. And the boy loved the tree very much. And the tree was happy. But time went by, and the boy grew older, and the tree was often left alone. So it's implied in the art that he meets a partner. You don't really see the faces, but you see their feet. And the boy has a heart that was him and the tree. He loves the tree. And then now there's a new heart with a new name, him and someone else. And now that he's a teenager, the tree was often alone. Then one day the boy came to the tree, and the tree said, "Come, boy, come and climb up my trunk and swing on my branches and eat apples and play in my shade and be happy." By the way, this might also make me cry, this book, but I'm reminded of Inside Out. I haven't seen Inside Out 2 yet, which is just a crime. But, Bing Bong, I watch every 6 months, I rewatch Inside Out. And this has like echoes of Bing Bong, the character, Anyway, so the tree says, "Come, boy, come and climb up my trunk and swing on my branches and eat apples and play in my shade and be happy." And he says, "I'm too big to climb and play. I want to buy things and have fun. I want some money. Can you give me some money?" And the tree says, "I'm sorry, but I don't have any money. I only have leaves and apples. Take my apples, boy, and sell them in the city, and then you will have money and you will be happy." And so the boy climbed up the tree and gathered her apples and carried them away, and the tree was happy. But the boy stayed away for a long time, and the tree was sad. And then one day the boy came back, so the boy is now a man. He looks maybe middle-aged or something. And the boy said, "Come, boy, climb up my trunk and swing on my branches and be happy." And he says, "I'm too busy to climb trees. I want a house to keep me warm. I want a wife. I want children. And so I need a house. Can you give me a house?" Tree says, "I have no house, but the forest is my house. But you may cut off my branches and build a house. Then you will be happy." And so the boy cut off her branches and carried them away to build a house. And so there's a picture of a branchless tree there, just a trunk. And the tree was happy. The boy stayed away for a long time. And when he came back, "Come, boy, come play." And the boy, now the man is elderly, looks, 80 years old or something. And he says, "I'm too old and sad to play. I want a boat that will take me far away from here. Can you give me a boat?" And the tree says, "Cut my trunk to make a boat and sail away, and you'll be happy." And so the boy cut down the entire tree and made a boat and sailed away. And the tree was happy, but not really. So that's the first time in the book where Shel Silverstein is saying, the tree was happy, but not really. And then the man comes back. Maybe he's 90, 100 years old. I don't know. And the boy came back. And the tree says, "I'm sorry, boy, but I have nothing left to give you. My apples are gone. But the man says, my teeth are too weak for apples. And then the tree says, my branches are gone. You can't swing on them. And the boy says, I'm too old to swing on branches. The tree says, my trunk is gone, so you can't climb. And then the man interrupts, I'm too tired to climb. And the tree says, I am sorry. I wish that I could give you something, but I have nothing left. I am just an old stump, and I am sorry. And the boy says, I don't need very much now, just a quiet place to sit and rest. I am very tired. Well, said the tree, and she straightened herself up as much as she could. An old stump is good for sitting and resting. Come, boy, sit down and rest. And the boy did. There's a picture of the old man sitting on the stump. And then it says, and the tree was happy. The end. It's so. When I read the story, YouTube member Sloan, when I read the story, what I see, so let me go through the different interpretations. As you say, some people say that the giving tree is the perfect parent, meaning that this is a celebration it's a metaphor for parenting, where it's not literally children destroying their parents, selfishly, but it's a metaphor for how parenting can feel, where you just unconditionally love your kids and you give and you give and you give, and you don't really get much back and you don't expect much back, and you're happy. You're happy to give. You're happy that your child has support from you, and you ask for nothing in return or very little in return. But you do long for them. You lament them leaving you and going off into the big broad world, but you love them so much you want them to be happy. And this is when I might cry. But the story really takes it pretty far, right? But I kind of like that in terms of art. Not everyone is like this. I imagine most people aren't. But for me, the kind of art that I like takes things kind of far, like with depressing music, like Depeche Mode or the Smiths or something. There could be some pretty harsh words in the song, like I want to die, I'm in so much pain, or something, Smashing Pumpkins or something. But when I'm singing along with those songs, I feel the intent, but I don't literally believe or feel those feelings or want to do those things, And that's what a lot of art is, whether it's emo music or certain kinds of hip hop, or it's a children's book. They are exaggerations. I'm sure that there are art critics who could speak more eloquently about this than I could, but that's how, one way of seeing it is that it's the perfect parent. That's not the way I necessarily see it, but that's one way people see it. It's hard not to see it that way because it very much seems like that, right? Other people, though, when they read this book, they consider it to be a horrible book with a horrible message, where essentially it's what they would say is that they believe this book written by Shel Silverstein is a message, maybe even specifically to women, right? That their only purpose on earth is to serve their sons or the men in their life. And they should be happy that the men just barely acknowledge their existence. And yeah, if that's how people receive this art, then that's how they receive it. But that's not how I receive it. And I imagine one's background might influence, or also I think just one's art preference. Like, I don't know why I want to bring this up, but I love Lord of the Rings. I've been reading the books my whole life, and I watch a lot of YouTube channels that are dedicated to Lord of the Rings. I'm deep in the weeds of the lore and the Silmarillion, and there's a bunch of letters that Tolkien also, because nerds would write in and say like, what about this thing? And then Tolkien and all of those letters are published, or a lot of them are, that elaborate on the world. And Tolkien was very buttoned up, similar to George Martin, in that there's not a lot of plot holes. There's not a lot of inconsistency. There are some things, but it all kind of makes sense. And there's so many things in those worlds, in the world of Middle Earth or in the world of Westeros, that for nerds like me, it really adds to the feeling of realism, or of stories making sense, people making sense within that world. And when Rings of Power, the Amazon TV show, came out, I was super excited. But and about halfway through the season, I was trying to enjoy it, and I was liking some things. The Elrond story I liked, but there are other things about it that I just was like, huh? But I didn't dislike it. I just thought, like, well, I'll just keep watching. But then something hit me about halfway through the season, and I was just like, what is happening? From my understanding, a lot of people love this show. They tend not to be super fans of Lord of the Rings, which is fine. It's just a goddamn TV show. Who gives a shit? But I can't stand this show. I can't, I was, it was sort of like when Umberto saw Episode 1, Star Wars. He really wanted to like it, and even after seeing it, he was trying to convince himself that it was awesome, because he needed to believe it was awesome. And so for me, I was trying to convince myself that I liked it, and now I despise the show. Each to their own, who cares? But really, it's just an artistic preference. I want the show to stick to the books more, or to be stylistically different. It's all just art form. So for this book, The Giving Tree, it's a form of art. And now, if it was explicitly giving that message and it was universally received that way, then yeah, it would be a bad book to propose that people read, that people, or maybe women, should not have boundaries and should sacrifice themselves for other people and not expect anything in return. That's a terrible message, but that's not the message that I take, and that's not the message a lot of people take. YouTube member Sloan, you also said that some people even found the book to be traumatizing. And yeah, I think particularly if you have a history of that, or you saw something like that happen. So let me tell you how I received this story, and why, even as a young child, I loved this book. It's not literal, the way that I receive it. The way that I receive it is, and in a way, this book could have been one step along the path for me to become a therapist. When I, as a therapist, particularly with clients that are actively attacking me, say someone with personality disorder, it feels like I'm the giving tree. Now, I do have boundaries, and I do protect myself, and I do advocate for myself, and I would walk away from a session and get love from my wife, or talk with Bob about things or something. I'm not just sitting there in my office suffering after a session. But in the moment, I feel kind of like the giving tree, where you give one directional, even when the client is wanting to hurt you. Or parenting. You have a kid that, generally speaking, isn't against you, but is going through a moment, is having a bad mood moment, and you're doing everything you can to make them happy, and they're being fussy, and they're saying things like they hate you, or you're stupid, or everything you suggest is dumb. And it's one directional, and you suck it up, and you give, and you give, and you don't ask. And after the 4-year-old has calmed down, you don't sit them down and say, hey, it's time for you to acknowledge what you did to me. You just don't do that because it developmentally isn't appropriate. And so you just give and you give. And then one day that kid is saying fuck you to you when you're 14, and then fast forward a little bit later and they can't wait to get out of your house. And they're talking about how great their life is now that they're at college, and it hurts your feelings, but you keep giving because, that's what parenting can be like. And of course, I'm emphasizing one side of things. Certainly a lot of kids can be giving as well. A lot of kids do. Most kids do give back in a lot of ways, through hugs or thank yous or attention or whatever. But, it's lopsided. And so this book, The Giving Tree, emphasizes that. And it's not just parenting, it's also just the act of giving and how that makes you happy. The tree says that she's happy, right? He cuts down her trees and she's happy. He comes back and chops down the entire tree and now she's a stump and she's happy. Looked at literally, it's awful. This boy, this man, is a horrible human being. There's another message here, which is environmentalism, which I think is a distant second to me in terms of how I received it, which is there's a lesson to be learned here, because in the end, if you look at it in terms of the artwork, the old man, the very, very old man sitting on the stump, and the way he talks, and I get chills thinking about this, he seems to be regretting his decisions. He's not looking back on his life and saying, or at least the way I interpret it, it's not explicit, and that's the thing about great art, is that it provokes, but it doesn't railroad you, And so when I see this, I see a man that regrets his life. He's happy to be sitting on this stump, and he feels bad. And it's a lesson for us of, okay, don't be this man. Don't just take and destroy the world. Be mindful of how you're living your life so that you're not him. That's another incredible message from this, because if you just look at the man, he doesn't ever look happy. Everything that his life, these updates on his life, none of them are, he doesn't come back and say, oh, my life's going really well. He's always struggling. Things aren't going well for him. So that's how I take it. But like I said, especially after, if I would have just read this email without watching that YouTube documentary, I wish I remembered the episode, but then I would have been like, what? People receive this book like you need better boundaries? That's weird. But after watching this documentary about it, I heard from a lot of people, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, geez, that's not how I receive it, but apparently a lot of people are receiving it that way. So apparently it's a normal, subset of reactions to this. So that's my take on the Giving Tree YouTube member Sloan. Let me know what you think or what anyone else thinks about this book or Shel Silverstein's work. There's a lot I can talk about with Shel Silverstein. He did a lot of things. It was the 60s and the early 70s. There's some controversy there. But Shel Silverstein is in the same camp as like Frank Oz and Sesame Street and The Muppet Show, and just the way that the 70s and the revolution regarding children's education and where I come from, it was a different time. Now there's so much commercialism in children's entertainment and education, but in the 50s and 60s, it basically didn't really exist. I mean, there was some element, like Howdy Doody or something. But in the 70s, there were all these revolutionaries, baby boomers, who were changing the world in all sorts of ways. and they were becoming parents, and they took a look around and said, well, the landscape of children's education and public television is bleak. We need to change that. What can we do? And the things that they did and the things that they tackled and the things that they created and sustained against all odds and against opposition is just, it's unparalleled. Mr. Rogers could be considered in that group. And Shel Silverstein is one of those major pillars of that time for me. So that's why I love The Giving Tree. And the fact that when I was a kid, this resonated with me, not in the same way it does today, but it did touch me in the ways that I'm talking about. My dog is barking. And that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. Truly. Even if you're a giving tree. You really, really do.